Hi everyone, I'm Nina Amato, Senior User Experience Designer at Brightfind. I've been building user-friendly 5-way compliant products for over a decade. I've designed and coded 5-way compliant websites and applications for the FDA, the Federal Highway Administration, and the Department of Transportation. To me, accessibility is an integral part of usability. Accessibility means making products that everyone can use. So today we're going to talk about who benefits from adding accessibility standards to our websites. We're going to talk about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, otherwise known as WCAG. We're going to talk about Section 508, and my main goal for us today is for us to actually really start to empathize with the members of our audience who benefit the most from these accessibility standards that we're implementing. So WebAIM conducted a survey last year of screen reader users, and they asked the participants, which of the following do you think is the primary reason that many developers don't create accessible websites? And you can see the respondents answered 43% of them thought it was from lack of awareness of web accessibility. 26.6% of them thought it was lack of web accessibility skills or knowledge. These numbers are terrible. As an industry, the web industry needs to do a lot better. So let's get started. Here we have a standard pie chart. I used red and green because I wanted to depict fictional quantities of fruit and vegetable consumption. I made the numbers up. It's not really relevant. What's relevant is that we have, on the left, we have the graph the way I made it, with red representing fruit and green representing vegetables. And on the right, we have the colorblind view. So this is how people who are red-green colorblind, which is the most common type of colorblindness, would see this pie chart. And as you can see, it practically looks like a circle. It's very hard to differentiate the slices. In addition to that, this isn't a very user-friendly pie chart. I don't have values listed, and it's really hard to, even if you're not colorblind, it's really hard to see how big is that green slice. Is that 75%? Is it 25%? Is it 20%? So this is not the most accessible way to make a pie chart. When we go to our next slide, we can see I made this pie chart much more accessible. The most important thing that I did here is I listed the values underneath the pie chart. Now, the values don't have to be listed underneath, but they do need to be listed. Both 508 compliance and WCAG both require that whenever you have an image, you also have to provide a text alternative to that image, which means you have to list your quantities. So this means that someone who's blind and using a screen reader, which we'll talk about in a little while, will be able to get the number values that this graph represents. And people who are colorblind will also be able to get the number values because they're listed. In addition to that, there are certain things that I did here to make this even more accessible and easier for people to use who are colorblind. So one of the things I did, and I recommend this all the time, is if you have two colors that are adjacent to each other, they're touching, add a border to separate them. Make the border either white or black, because colorblind people will be able to see the contrast, as will everyone with full spectrum vision. They'll be able to see the contrast. So that way, even if the colors do look alike, you can still differentiate the slices on your pie chart. In addition to that, here, I actually adjusted my color palette to make it a little easier to differentiate the colors in the colorblind view. So if we go back, we can see here I was using a really intense red and a really intense bright green. And on this other slide, I added a lot of blue value to the green. So the graphic designers watching this, they know that colors on the screen are represented with RGB, red, green, and blue. And so I added more blue to our green. And the reason I did that is because people who are red-green colorblind can still see blue, and they can also still see yellow. So when you add blue to a color like green, it helps to differentiate it a little bit. So it also is helping to differentiate the value from the red. By muting the green and having the red darker, you can see more contrast here. So that's just a way to help make it so you can have more contrast between the two. So if you want to see how your graphics look to a colorblind user, there's a couple of things you can do. If you have Photoshop or Illustrator, you can go under the View menu and go to Proof Setup and then Color Blindness. And then you can choose Deuteranopia, which is the option for red-green color blindness. And that will let you see how your images look to someone who's colorblind. That's what I did here. So there's also a Chrome plugin called Spectrum, and I have a URL for it listed here on this slide, which you can install on Chrome, and that will show you how your websites look to someone who's colorblind. So let's talk about who has visual impairments and how is this needed. 285 million people worldwide suffer from visual impairments. 39 million people in the world are blind, and 246 million people have low vision. 8% of men and half of 1% of women with Northern European ancestry are red-green colorblind. So that's a pretty big number. So we want to be able to be thinking about that when we are designing things. So, screen readers. Blind users cannot see the images we put on the web. They use screen readers that read content aloud to them. We're actually going to hear a snippet of a screen reader reading content aloud in a little while. When a screen reader gets to an image, like a photo, it will read the alternative text that we code into that image. So below I have a sample of an image, but I made it black. And the reason I made it black is so that we can't really see the photo. Well, we can't see the photo at all. And the idea is I want you to imagine, what do you think of in your head when you hear the alternative text, photo of a golden retriever? Just stop and think, okay, photo of a golden retriever, what am I picturing? Did you imagine something like the photo on the left, or maybe something like the photo on the right? On the left, we have an older golden retriever. He's very sad. He's laying on the floor. On the right, we have a golden retriever who's jubilant. He is happily sticking his head out of a car window that's riding along on the highway. You can just see the joy in his face. So even though these are both photos of a golden retriever, they're very, very different. And the point is that when you just put something generic in alt text, it may not convey what everyone else sees when they see the photo. So it's really important to stop and think about the alternative text that we're putting in our photos so that we're sure that we're really conveying what we want to convey. Now, screen readers will read alt text for images, and they will also read a title attribute. You never want to use the same exact text for your alt attribute and your title attribute because it's going to read both. So if you have the exact same text for both, it's going to repeat everything. So an example of what this might sound like from a screen reader. Company logo, slider image depicting a man walking up the stairs. Slider image depicting a man walking up the stairs. Slider image of a crowd of protesters. Slider image of a crowd of protesters. So you can tell that's not the best user experience. Imagine if every photo, every description of it was repeated twice. That's not great. So you want to put the descriptive text in your alt attribute. The title attribute is just intended to add additional text on top of that. So put your descriptions in your alt attribute. Data tables. Data tables are read aloud by screen readers, and the way they're read aloud depends on how they're coded. Even though it looks a certain way, you need to add the attribute scope equals col and scope equals row to your header cells. And these are things your web developers can look up so that they can see, how this acts and how it works. But essentially what it does is it takes your header cells, which are usually the first column going all the way down a table, and the very first row at the top of the table, and it reads that content before it reads each cell of the content. And it does that so that it gives screen reader users context. So who benefits from making accessibility a priority? We have blind users we've already talked about, that they use screen readers that read page content aloud to them. Blind users also navigate websites with the keyboard only. They can't use a mouse because they can't see the targets to click to. They benefit from something called skip navigation. We're going to talk about that in a little while. And screen reader users sometimes may tab through headings. And what I mean by that is if you have a page with a lot of context, a lot of content on it, a lot of text, you want to break up that text with headings. For the developers out there, I'm referring, when I say headings, I mean H1 tags, H2, H3, H4, etc. And particularly H2, H3. And the reason you want to do that is because if you're a screen reader user and there's a lot of content on a page, you can tab to just the headings, and that way you can decide what do I want to listen to, and then they can go back and listen to the sections they want to listen to, instead of having to have everything read aloud to them. Headings also help usability in general because people like to scan, but it's particularly important for screen reader users. There are also users who are visually impaired but not blind, so they're not using a screen reader, but they might be using Zoom, and they're going to need stronger color contrast, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. You have deaf users who will need to they'll need to read captioning for video and audio content. You have users with cognitive challenges, and some of the recommendations by WCAG for users with cognitive challenges can be you can include a sitemap, which makes it easier for people to see exactly what content is going to be listed throughout the website and makes it easier for them to find it. Also, sometimes adding search functionality is important because some people might prefer to search for a term instead of trying to find it in your navigation structure, particularly if the navigation structure is really big. You also have people who have challenges with fine motor skills. So using a computer mouse, that requires a fair degree of fine motor skills, and sometimes this can be a challenge for some people. You know, perhaps they're on certain medication that impedes their fine motor skills. Maybe they've had a stroke, maybe they have Parkinson's, maybe they've broken their arm. There are reasons why some people may not use a mouse. Some people with cognitive challenges have difficult with fine motor skills too, in which case they're going to be using a keyboard only or another tool, so you need to make sure that your websites can be completely accessed by tabbing. Now, in addition to that, you also have users that are subject to seizures, and so you need to avoid content that flashes more than 3 times per second. And this isn't covered by the guidelines, but I added it because I think it's important. You have users with dyslexia sometimes, and people with dyslexia can be challenged by full justified text. And what I mean by full justified text is if you think of a newspaper and you think of how the text perfectly aligns on the left and the right, the way it does that is because it adds extra space in between the words, and that extra space can be challenging for readers with dyslexia. So it's going to be easier for them to read content that's left aligned as opposed to full justified. And then also, pure black text on a pure white background can be very difficult for people with dyslexia to read because it's so much contrast that the words can appear to dance on the page. They can appear to slightly move. And so studies have found that you're better off using either a light cream background with black text or softening your text from a pure black to a dark, dark, dark gray. And for the developers listening, by dark, dark, dark gray, I mean pound 222 or pound 333 instead of the pure black of pound 000. All right, so who creates and maintains accessibility guidelines? There's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.0, and then there's Section 508, and we're going to talk about both of those. So we're going to start with WCAG 2.0. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.0, were developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, that's the W3C, and they were developed by their Web Accessibility Initiative. And I have a URL right here where you can go and you can learn all about this. WCAG 2.0 standards were published in 2008, and they actually became an ISO standard in 2012. So they require text alternatives for images, like we just talked about, also text alternatives for animations, text alternatives for videos. Also, you need text alternatives for time-based media, again, adding captioning. Another option of something you could do in addition to adding captioning is you could add sign language descriptions, sign language with it, and add descriptions of what you're showing. So WCAG requires that websites be adaptable. They need to be in a meaningful sequence. And so examples of this, and they can't rely on one sense. So when I say sense, I mean, for example, you cannot have instructions that rely on sound. If you have someone reading instructions, that's fine, but you also have to have a text alternative because people who are hearing impaired won't be able to hear the instructions. You can't rely on just one sense. So that's what that means by sense. Websites have to be distinguishable. You cannot rely on color or size as the only way to show meaning. So earlier I showed that pie chart where all I showed were red and green, and I said red means fruit and green means vegetables, and I didn't show number values on my first slide. That's not compliant. You can't do that because people who are colorblind won't be able to see the red and the green, and they won't be able to see the difference as we saw on my first slide. And also, people who are blind can't see it either. So you have to actually list the values. You cannot rely on color or size. And when I say you can't rely on size, what I mean is you can't have a big circle and a small circle and say the big circle represents this and the small circle represents that. I mean, you can have the visual, but you also have to provide a text alternative that explains what the visual shows. Audio controls that audio that plays for more than 3 seconds needs pause and stop controls. And text and images of text need to have sufficient contrast compared to its background. And so here is a demonstration of what I mean of this. You can see on this slide the text starts out very, very dark gray with lots of contrast, and on each line it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And as it gets lighter, it gets harder to read. Now, the older we get, the less contrast we're able to see. Our ability to see contrast diminishes as we age. So there's a certain standard for how much contrast you have to have for the text on your websites compared to their background image. And that number is 4.5 to 1 for normal text. And by normal text, I mean paragraph text. And 3 to 1 for large text. For large text, I mean the big bold headings. And you can check the color contrast using a color contrast checker. I like WebAIM's color contrast checker, and I have the URL right here, and there's other ones online too. So here is a screen capture of WebAIM's color contrast checker. The foreground color is the color code for your text, for your font. So your developers will be able to tell you, if it's pound 333, if it's pound 555. Here, as an example, I used a relatively light gray text. You can actually see a picture of it at the bottom of the slide where it says sample, and it says I am normal text, and it's in a box. That's the color text that I tested. So the number value for that is 9E, 9E, 9E. I entered that in the foreground color box. The background color is white because my page background is white. And when I clicked the button, it told me that I failed. I only have a color contrast ratio of 2.68 to 1, so I'm failing, so that text is too light. So this is how that works. So in addition to that, WCAG 2.0 requires that websites be operable. And what that means is all parts of a website must be accessible by the keyboard only. And again, this is for our users who are not using a mouse. So you need to be able to tab through everything. Certain places where I've seen this become a problem are date pickers and sometimes in forms, especially when you get checkboxes and radio boxes. So you need to, radio buttons, you need to make sure that you can tab to every part of your website with just the key, or get to it with just the keyboard, and that the cursor never gets stuck. They call that a trap, where suddenly it's like, okay, your cursor's somewhere and you can't get it out with just the keyboard. You need to click away with a mouse. That's not compliant. You can't do that. In addition, when time limits are set, the user must be given the option to extend the time limit. As we said, elements on a website can't flash more than 3 times in 1 second. Users must have the option to bypass blocks of content that repeat on multiple pages. And so that is a skip navigation link. Content also has to have headings that break up the content so users can easily skip to the section. So we already talked about that. So let's talk about skip navigation for a minute. Most websites have a navigation. Usually it's a top nav, sometimes it's a left nav. And what I mean by skip navigation is, let's say you have users who come to your website often. Let's say you publish articles, and you tend to publish articles, daily or every other day, very often. And users come to this one page because they want to read the latest articles, and let's say they're using a screen reader. A screen reader is going to read aloud everything on the page, and that means it's going to read through every heading in your top navigation. And it's going to read through all of that, and your left navigation. It's going to read through all of those until it finally gets to the content that the user wants to hear. Now, if a user is a frequent visitor, they know they're not going anywhere else in the site, they want to have the option to not have to listen to the top navigation read to them every single time they visit the page. So as soon as you get to a page, the user should be able to click Tab and then be able to skip past the navigation and go directly down to the content so they don't have to hear the navigation read aloud to them. WebAIM, as part of their survey last year, they asked users, how often do you use these skip navigation links if they're offered? And you can see the results here. 68% of them say they use it at least sometimes. So 30% said sometimes, 19.5% said often, 18.3% said whenever they're available, meaning always. And you add that up, that's 68% who use it at least sometimes. And it's required, and you can see it is utilized and appreciated. WCAG 2.0 also requires that websites be understandable. So this means you need to keep your navigation consistent from page to page. You can't switch the order that nav items in. Something can't be first here and then, 3 pages in, it's the fourth item. It needs to be consistent. They recommend using breadcrumbs so the user always knows where they are in the site architecture. This is also beneficial for users who land on an interior page, say from a link someone else posted or from a search engine. You want to have that breadcrumb trail so users know where they are in the site architecture. And then forms have to have labels. What I mean by labels are, let's say you're filling out a form and you need to enter your first name, last name, and email address. First name is the text that says first name, and it's the text next to the box or above the box where you would actually enter your name. That text that says first name needs to be in an HTML label tag. It also needs to be assigned to the specific text box, the input, that where the user would type. And so there's 2 ways that you can assign it. You can either wrap the input inside the label tag, or if you don't wrap them, you can use a for attribute on your label, and the for is equal to the ID of that text input. And there's a tool we're going to talk about in a little while that will check that for you, so that way if you forgot to do some of those, it will check those. So form labels are required because a screen reader is going to read aloud. It's going to read aloud the labels and then say the associated text box so that people who can't see know what element they're typing into. WCAG also requires that websites be robust. And what they mean by that is you need to use valid HTML. All tags need to be closed properly. They need to be nested appropriately. You can't have HTML errors because that could cause some problems. They also recommend adding ARIA roles. So, for example, ARIA label is just one of the many ARIA tags that you can add. But if you cannot have a visible label, let's just say, I don't know, maybe you don't really have room to put search by your search bar, you can add an ARIA label instead. All right. Tables. They recommend that you don't use tables for layout. They don't forbid it. You can do it. But they recommend that you use either CSS for layout or an HTML framework such as Bootstrap for your column layout instead of using layout tables whenever possible. If you do use a table for layout, add the attribute summary equals layout. So that way it tells the screen reader, this table is just for layout, it's not data that you need to listen to, because that can be confusing to someone who's listening to a table being read aloud. In addition to that, data tables, and these are tables that list, number values or some kind of a lot of data in them. We have to use them, and they need to be structured properly. Most importantly, they need the attributes scope equals col to represent column headers and scope equals row to represent the row header. All right, so that was WCAG. Now we're going to talk about 508 compliance. Section 508 refers to Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. The Rehabilitation Act, the Section 508 guidelines are maintained by the Access Board, and I have a link to the Access Board website there so you can go and you can learn all about it. The Section 508 guidelines are required for all federal government websites. So what do they require? They require text equivalent for images and multimedia. We talked about that. That was alt text, captioning, etc. Transcripts of video, etc. All information conveyed with color must also be conveyed without color. We talked about that with the pie chart. Same thing. You have to have your number values in there in addition to using color. Websites must be readable without a style sheet. So if your style sheet is adding content, like you can use the content colon to add text, if you disable styles, all of that needs to still be visible to the user, and some screen readers that won't read styles. Image maps have redundant text links so that they can be navigated if you can't see. Data tables have row and column tags. Data table cells will be associated with a header cell. Frames are titled for text identification, and I have a link at the bottom of this slide so you can go and you can see these standards yourself. I copied these from the Access Board website where they're listed. That's why I have a reference there. You can allow the screen to flicker at too great a rate. Web pages that are not accessible need to have a text equivalent page. So for example, if you had one page and it was just a big infographic, you need to have a text equivalent page that explains that infographic. Especially if it's too much data for a long, you could use a long description attribute too, but again, that links to another page that has a text description. Information that's created with scripts, like for example JavaScript, will be available to be read by assistive technology. Websites requiring a plugin will provide a link to a plugin that complies with 508 standards. You need to have your skip navigation. We talked about that. And timed applications must notify users of time constraints and allow them to add more time. So these standards were published in the year 2000. The Section 508 standards are currently being revised. The Access Board is referring to this as the refresh, the Section 508 refresh. And so I put a quote here from their website and a link below the quote so you can actually see it. And so they are recommending, the proposed rule is saying that they're going to incorporate the WCAG 2.0 standards that we talked about, and they're going to apply that. And so you can read about it here, and then on the next slide, I have a link to a table they have that's showing which of the WCAG 2.0 standards are going to be incorporated, and it shows which of these are new for the 508 standards. So it's like, okay, we're adding this, we didn't require it before, but now it's a new standard. So the table shows that, so that's really handy. Okay. Now we're going to talk about ARIA tags. ARIA is an acronym for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And these specifications were created and recommended by the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. The technical specifications are at this URL listed here on the slide. So ARIA attributes give instructions to screen reader software. They tell it how to operate. And there are a lot of ARIA tags, so I'm not going to go through all of them because there are a lot. But I want to demonstrate two very important ones. And so I'm actually going to link to a video from Aaron Cannon. Now, Aaron Cannon is a web developer, and he did a fantastic job explaining two ARIA attributes, ARIA Live and ARIA Atomic. And you can get to these videos on his YouTube channel, so that's Aaron Cannon's YouTube channel, and I have the URL right here. And you can also get to them from his website, which is canonaccess.com. So we're going to spend about 5 minutes right now watching his video. We're just going to watch the first 5 minutes of the video because it just does such a great job. It does a better job than I can of explaining and demonstrating how these ARIA tags work. What's important to note is that Aaron Cannon is using the screen reader JAWS. So you can actually hear JAWS, the most commonly used screen reader, reading page content to him as a user.
And in this video, I wanted to talk about ARIA Live regions. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the attributes ARIA-Live and ARIA-Atomic. And I'm going to demonstrate how those work with screen readers, specifically JAWS 11, which is the latest version of JAWS. And we're going to be working in Firefox, as you can see, and that's also the latest version. So what are live regions? Well, essentially, live regions make it possible for you, the web designer, to tell screen reader users that a particular portion of your web page has been updated. Now, if you don't use ARIA and you just have your web page update dynamic content, and the reader doesn't happen to review that portion of the web page, the screen reader doesn't go over that portion, then the user will never know that it's changed. And so ARIA, like I said, allows you to notify the user of that fact. And so let me just show you, this web page has a little bit of dynamic content on it. It's going to change the color name every 2 seconds after I click the start button. So let me go ahead and click the start button, and you'll hear that the screen reader will not say anything. So as you can hear, the screen reader hasn't said anything, even though you can see that the color name has been updated. If I go and actually read that line with the screen reader, I can tell what it says at this point in time.
Like my favorite color is purple. Like my favorite color is white.
So I can read that line, no problem, but the issue is that unless I know that it's going to change, I wouldn't know to go reread that portion because I've already read it. Why would I need to read it again? Users don't, in general, expect content to change on web pages, and so they're not likely to reread it and go looking for changes. So let me add a little bit of ARIA now to this page.
Alt tab, library, S, greater, P, greater, space, ARIA dash LB equals, quote, T-O-L-I-E, quote, quote, greater.
So I have ARIA dash live equals polite, as you can see, and the ARIA dash live attribute has 4 different possible settings. Off, which is the default, and that's what you heard. Basically, it means don't worry about it, or don't read it. Polite, which is this setting. Assertive, and rude. And these are listed in order of assertiveness. Basically, how hard the screen reader will work to get the user's attention. So let's just start out with polite, and
Control,
save that,
Alt tab,
and reload.
Control R, version 5,
Okay, now I'm going to click the start button, and you'll hear what the screen reader does.
start button, enter, start, green, red, purple, white, Alt tab, live.
So as you can hear, it does read the color name as it updates. However, that doesn't give us very much context. Now this is a very simple page, so it's probably pretty easy for the user to figure that one out. But say this was a very large page, and we just read the updated content. Well, the updated content is very small. It may not give enough context to the user to know what's being updated, white what. So if we want to offer a little more context, we can cause the screen reader to reread the entire element rather than just the portion that changes. So
Greater, quote, greater,
the way we do that is by the atomic attribute.
space, A-I-A dash A-E-O-L-C equals, quote, T-E, quote.
Okay, so now I have ARIA dash atomic equals true. So let me go ahead and save this and show you what happens when we use that.
Control S, Alt tab, must Control R, 100 virtual piece, file start button, enter, start button. My favorite color is green. My favorite color is red. My favorite color is purple. My favorite color is white.
Okay. So that was fantastic. I really love that video because it demonstrates how ARIA Live tells the screen reader to check another part of the page that updated. So when would we apply that? Well, let's say we are lower down on a web page and we have a button that adds something to a shopping cart. Let's say we're choosing to join and be a member of something and choose a membership. We're buying a membership, and we have a shopping cart that indicates that we just added something to our membership. But the membership button to join is at the bottom of the page, and then the shopping cart is up at the top of the page. If the shopping cart icon changes and it's at the top of the page, the screen reader is not going to read that out loud unless you add ARIA Live and ARIA Atomic to it. And that's going to tell the screen reader to read it out loud. Now, Aaron goes into more detail in that video. I did cut it short, where he explains, you know, he talks about the different settings you can give ARIA Live, and he mentioned that there's the rude setting, there's the polite setting. So if you go and you watch his video, you can see how those work, and you can see him demonstrate it and listen, and those are really fantastic. I highly recommend you go to his YouTube channel and see that. So how do we test for website accessibility? Well, the W3C has a list of web accessibility evaluation tools, and I put a URL for that there. So that is a great resource. There's a lot of tools listed there. Another option that you can have in addition to that is you can actually download a screen reader and see what does your website sound like. NVDA is a free screen reader for Windows. Now, they do request you make a donation when you download it, but you can download it for free. Whereas JAWS is very, very expensive. You can get that too, certainly. NVDA is a free alternative that will just let you hear, you know, what your website sounds like. I also like to use the Wave browser plugin, and I have URLs for that listed here. Wave is when you install the plugin on your website. It adds a little icon at the top of your browser. When you install it in your browser, it adds an icon at the top of the browser. And when you click that icon, it shows you some of the errors you have on your website. It's not going to show you everything, but it's going to tell you if your label tags don't have a for attribute, or they're not associated with a label because they both don't have a for attribute, and they're not your input tags aren't nested inside them. Forms have other requirements that we didn't talk about, but that are listed in the URLs in this slide deck. For example, they have to have field sets. They have to have legends. A field set is a group of form elements that belong together, and you use a field set tag. The legend describes the title of the form. So these are required, and Wave will tell you if you don't have them. So it's a really good tool. I always use it. Even if I'm coding a page, I use it because occasionally I might forget something, and I always run Wave and say, oh, I forgot the for attribute in my label. I need to go check that. I forgot alt tags. It's also going to warn you if your alt tag text matches your title text for an image. It's going to give you a warning so you can go and change that. It's also really important to navigate every web page using the keyboard only. And so here I listed the keys that you would use to do that. You use the Tab key generally to go forwards, usually the Shift and Tab keys together to go backwards. The space bar is sometimes used to select and unselect checkboxes or radio buttons. Sometimes it's the arrow key, sometimes it's the Enter key, sometimes it's the space bar. It can depend. You can also use your arrow keys and your Enter keys. Those are the basic ones that are usually used when you want to test. And you want to make sure that there are no keyboard traps, meaning that there's not a place where the cursor gets stuck if you're using your keyboard only and not your mouse. You also need to test that all of your links get visual focus. And what I mean by that, I mean is an outline when they're tabbed to. So there are users who are using a keyboard only, they're not using a mouse, but they're not using a screen reader, they're not blind, but they're tabbing to links. And by default, the way a browser behaves is when you tab onto a link, it gets an outline. It's usually a dotted outline. But some CSS resets actually remove the dotted outline. Some designers remove it because they don't like the way it looks. So, you know, check your CSS reset, see if it's removing the outline. You can easily check by just tabbing on your page, and when you get to a link, if you don't see a visual indicator like a border that you're on the link, you need to add one. And the reason for that is because if you're tabbing through a web page, you don't necessarily know that your cursor has landed on a link unless you have a visual indicator that, yes, it's landed on this link, and if I hit enter, I'm now going to go to that page. And so you need to have that. So you need to check for that. You also need to check that your data tables are structured properly. This is especially important, like the T-head, T-body, T-footer, especially important if your tables are really long and they span multiple pages. But you have to have scope equals col and scope equals row for your data tables. I put, again, the link for the color contrast checker that I like. You need to check your color contrast. There's other tools out there. The WebAIM one is the one I like. Check for ARIA tags. Also, view websites with styles disabled. That means you need to make sure that if you disable your style sheet or someone's seeing it without a style sheet, that all of the content is still there, and it's still accessible, and it still goes in the same order. So one way to do that is with the Web Developer Toolbar, and I have a link for that there. And I just want to conclude by thanking everyone for listening to this webinar. It will be online at the Brightfind website under Resources, where we list our webinars. And we also are available, there's contact info on the Brightfind website, that's brightfind.com if you want to contact us. And thank you very much for listening.